innovation. Beijing is shaped by a different history. It's more inward looking and nationalistic. Well, gosh, it sounds like America. But Jonathan, you begin and end with that. So I'd like to ask you the large question, which is your way of thinking about how both these families, the Qadharis and the Sassoons, dealt with their own, if you will, contradiction. On the one hand, you call them the early globalists. On another, they were tight families and they were devoted to their businesses. So how in your mind, in general, do you think they dealt with this, if you will, bifurcation of their lives?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for having me here. It's great. Obviously, I sometimes tell people I feel like I'm living under one of those old Yiddish curses, which is, may your book come out during a pandemic when all the bookstores are closed. But what's wonderful about events like this is it's a chance to connect with readers, connect with people interested in the topics. So thank you all for zooming in today. I think when we think about Jewish history, when we think about Jews in the world, we're all familiar with the story of Fiddler on the Roof, right? Which is, Jews growing up in ghettos in Europe or here in the US, and then kind of climbing upward and often achieving great success. But when I was looking at these two families, their history is very different, and I think speaks to this bifurcation that you talk about. The Qadharis and the Sassoons were from Baghdad, and they were part of that group of Jews who had been sort of taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and deposited in Baghdad, which was Babylon. And we know Babylon from the Bible, obviously, by the waters of Babylon, there we wept when we remembered Zion. But while the Jews in Baghdad and Babylon may have wept in the Bible, they actually succeeded enormously in Baghdad. They were incredibly successful. And so successful, in fact, that they really became the sort of economic backbone of Baghdad. And whoever was ruling Baghdad, the Turks, the Persians, the Ottomans, turned to them often to help them run the country. And in fact, the Jews were so prominent that the Turkish rulers named one family to be, they were called the Nasi, N-A-S-I, which literally meant the Prince of the Jews. And the Sassoons, one of the families I write about, were named the Prince of the Jews in Baghdad. And that meant not only were they incredible businessmen and traders, but they also advised the king. They were almost the secretary of the treasury to the king. And whenever the Sassoon leader of the family was carried in a sedan chair to meet the Pasha at his palace, everyone in Baghdad, Jew and non-Jew alike, bowed their head in reverence and respect. And so one of the things that I think Baghdad created was this was in a way the first diaspora Jewish community. This was an outward-looking community that survived by trade, by working with the government. In some ways, I think they're the first model of how many Jews live today, how many of us have lived, where you are, your religion is important to you, but you're living in the world and you're affecting the world and very often having great success in the world. So when the Sassoons and the Qadharis make their way to China, their view is already very global. And China has gone through a very difficult time. This is by the 1840s. And China is very divided. There are those who want to modernize China. There are those who want to learn from the West. And then there are those who just want to kind of button things up and shut themselves off. And so what the Sassoons and the Qadharis do is they really form alliances with those Chinese who want to open up the country. Now, to be fair, the Sassoons and the Qadharis, again, unlike maybe the typical story we hear about Jews globally, we tend to think of Jews as being on the side of the underdog, or they're the poor Jews who are socialists and want to kind of bring justice to the world. The Sassoons are different. The Sassoons, as I said, are this very prominent dynasty in Baghdad. Things do turn against them at a certain point in the 1820s. And David Sassoon, who is supposed to take over the family dynasty, is kidnapped and put in jail by the Pasha, by the ruler of Baghdad. And his father is very worried that this is going to become a pattern and that the ransom will never end and that his son might eventually be killed. So he bails him out of prison, smuggles him down to the waterfront, where he puts him onto a boat. And as the boat is leaving, he gives his son a cloak that has pearls sewn into the cloak. And he sends him off on this ship for safety. And David Sassoon, the son, who was supposed to kind of lead this empire, spends his first night out of Baghdad in a warehouse in a town along the waterfront there, hiding in a warehouse, holding a gun, shooting at rats as they're skittering by. And so I think the story of the Sassoon family is not the one we hear of maybe like the Rothschilds in Europe, or even of families here in the US, of a poor family that ascends to great success. It's really almost Shakespearean. It's a family that was already at the peak of its power and influence, and then the prince has his everything ripped away from him, and he basically is now spending the rest of his life trying to get back to that high position he once had. And so David Sassoon arrives in India first, just at the time the British are arriving from Europe, and they're conquering India, and they're about to make India part of the British Empire. And David Sassoon looks around, and he basically says, "I'm going to go with the British." He considered himself of a kind of royal lineage. He saw that the future of India lay in British hands. So he taught, even though he never learned English, he taught his children English. He made sure that they had tutors to teach them English. He had 8 sons. He became a British citizen. When he declared his British citizenship, he declared his loyalty to Queen Victoria by signing his name in Hebrew letters, but he then said that he was loyal to the Queen. And in fact, when Queen Victoria is made queen, he stands on the banks of the river in Bombay and sings "God Save the Queen" in his broken English, along with his sons. So he decides very early on that he wants to be part of this expansion of the world and of Britain into Asia. And as part of his business dealings, he starts dealing opium. And it's very profitable dealing opium. And then in the 1840s, when Britain decides to open up China, the Opium Wars come along, Britain defeats China, China is open for trade. David Sassoon looks there, and as a smart businessman says, there's a lot of money to be made in China. So he enters China with this globalized view. And when his sons, who are really his executives, his intelligence service, these 8 sons he spreads all across China. And their goal, wherever they go, is to find business arrangements with the Chinese and to find a way to become part of this global business empire that's developing, centered around London and Bombay. And ultimately, his 8 sons, they're in China, they're in Bombay, they're in London, they go to Buckingham Palace. And so they, like the Chinese, are also outward looking. They're not inward looking. They were never in a shtetl. They don't have any of that mentality. They really see themselves as to the manner born. And from the very start, are determined to connect with Chinese who have a similar mindset.
Mm-hmm. So that's their family. Now, could you switch over to the Qadharis, because it is a very different story that ends up also with a lot of wealth.
Yeah, the Qadharis are an interesting family. In some ways, I think of the Sassoons like the Rockefellers, right? They have enormous wealth. The Sassoons are, by the 1930s, are probably the 6th wealthiest family in the world. Victor Sassoon, who I'll talk about a little bit later, is a Playboy billionaire living in Shanghai, enormously wealthy. The Qadharis are distant relatives of the Sassoons in Baghdad. And they fall on hard times. The father dies, and there are 6 boys. And the mother is very concerned and trying to figure out how the family will survive. And so one of the things that the Sassoons have done as they're expanding in China is they need people to work for them They need clerks. They need people to run the businesses in all these cities as they're expanding. And so they're trying to decide who they can trust. And it turns out the people they can trust are other Jews from Baghdad. And so they set up a system, they're called Sassoon Schools, and it's almost like a company town. They go to families, Jewish families in Baghdad, and they say, if you send us your teenagers, we'll basically make sure they're schooled. We'll make sure they have a job when they graduate. If they get sick, we're going to fund a Jewish hospital. If God forbid they die, we have a Jewish cemetery. They build Jewish synagogues. And so it's a way these families in Baghdad can send their teenagers off to these godforsaken places, India and China, that they've only barely heard of, but know that they'll be taken care of. And what that means is that the Qadharis send several of their sons, but Eli Qadhari, who becomes the patriarch, is 15 years old when he leaves home. And he's 18 years old when he finally makes it to China. And you can only imagine what it's like for an 18-year-old boy to suddenly land in China. He doesn't speak Chinese. He's had some rudimentary training in mathematics and in working for a business and in trading. But it's a pretty frightening possibility. But Eli Qadhari, who becomes the founder of the Qadhari dynasty, is a brilliant man. And early on, he's working for the Sassoons in a port town north of Shanghai. And he looks around and he thinks, boy, there's an awful lot of money to be made here in China. And why am I working for the Sassoon family when I could make it myself? And so he goes to Hong Kong and really starts the dynasty there. And he's scrappier. You know, he was never as prominent as the Sassoons were. And one of the things I kind of like about the Qadharis is that they really have to work for it. And part of the challenge they face is there is a lot of anti-Semitism among the British in Hong Kong. The Chinese are not anti-Semitic at all. They really don't quite understand who these Jews are. They just consider them all foreigners who are living in Shanghai. But the British have a great deal of social anti-Semitism towards the Qadharis and towards the Sassoons. And as a result, the Qadharis are forced to kind of create these business alliances with other immigrants, with Chinese. And so they're able to build their fortune with all those connections. And again, that builds a sense of understanding of how China operates. And both families are so successful, they're really able to drive out these big British companies that are doing business because they're more innovative. The Sassoons, for example, when they start on the opium trade, they use steamships, which is something that hasn't been used before, to ship opium from India to China. They're much faster than the sailing ships the big British firms are using. They use the telegraph, which is, again, they're the first family to use the telegraph, so that the sons, the brothers who are in Shanghai can let the brothers in Bombay know when to load the opium because the price is high enough. The Qadharis bring electricity to Hong Kong. They're very much at the forefront of modernization. And the two families have a kind of rivalry in that the Sassoons always looked down on the Qadharis because they were always the poor relative. And the Qadharis themselves become billionaires. And today the Qadharis are the richest Western family in China. They ended up, after losing almost everything under communism, going to Hong Kong, where they rebuilt their fortune. So by these two very different paths, the two families end up working together, occasionally competing against each other, but shaping China as it emerges in the 1840s through to today.
Well, is the disinfectant story true?
Well, you know, yeah, the story that the Qadharis like to tell is that Eli Qadhari, the patriarch, was a young man, was working for the Sassoons, and bubonic plague came to this town where he was working. And the Sassoon relative who was in charge was off on some business trip, so Eli Qadhari was in charge. And the family story is that Eli Qadhari wanted to give disinfectant to Chinese and others to protect against the bubonic plague. And that when the Sassoons came back, they said to him, you know, why did you give that away? You should have charged for it. And they called him down to Shanghai to give him a talking to. And as the family story goes, Elly Kaduri said, well, if you won't let me be a moral businessman, I quit. That's a great story. We all hear great stories about our relatives when we're growing up. I think privately, the family probably agrees that Elly Kaduri looked around and thought, I could make a lot more money on my own. So maybe he did leave kind of in a huff, but I think the huff was to sort of go off and kind of make his own way. Although I have to say, I think both families, while they were very wealthy, they certainly were part of the British aristocracy that was ruling much of Shanghai during those years. Both families did have a very strong philanthropic streak. They were, I think, often like we see with successful Jews in this country, Mike Bloomberg, people like that, they may be, smart businessmen, but they also have a heart. And so I think both families did retain, in large part because of the women in the families, actually. The women in the families very often were the conscience of these families. And they steered both families as they became wealthier to help the Chinese and to reach out to them. So there may be a grain of truth to the story, but with family stories, as we know, they're always kind of shaded in a positive light.
I want to come back to that, because I'm going to ask a question in the midst of the interview that I know we'll receive later from someone, so I want to get to it right off. But first, you yourself in the book point out that the Sassoons and the Qadharis both took a mixed, if you will, view of China and the Chinese. They were not above exploiting Chinese labor. They were not above living in the bubble that was the quarter of Shanghai where they lived. And they both became involved in the opium trade. Now,
well, the Sassoons, the Qadharis, I don't think were that involved in opium. The Sassoons more than got involved. They ran the opium trade. They became immensely wealthy from it. I mean, I think what we have to acknowledge is, and again, this is something, I often say this is not the book you necessarily, your kids or grandkids read about in Sunday school, because it's, these are Jews who are acting like businessmen, but even more than that, they're acting as imperialists and colonialists. They were British. They followed the Union Jack, and they ended up kind of being no better and no worse than the other British who were colonial masters, really, in India and in Shanghai. And it's interesting because I think the Sassoons, as I say, the Sassoons, because they were so innovative and so smart at business, they basically drove out the big British companies that were running the opium trade. And they were able to take it over. And, when I spoke to descendants of the family, they said, well, it's like cigarettes. It's like liquor. This was a vice and we were catering to it. And there's truth in that. The fact was opium was legal back in the 1900s and the late 1800s. And you could grow it legally in India. It was taxed by the British government. You could sell it legally in China because the British forced the Chinese to make it legal. And about 12% of China was addicted to opium by the end of the 19th century. Now, as a point of comparison, about 2% of Americans are addicted to opioids. So you can see the kind of furor that the opioid crisis has created in America. Imagine if it were 5 or 6 times that, and you get a sense of what China faced. The Chinese government was very opposed to opium, but the British had won the war, and so they were forced to legalize it. So the Sassoons did see it as a great business opportunity. And after the communists took over, the communists seized the business records of the Sassoons that had gone back 100 years in Shanghai. And I was able to see them. And the Chinese communists calculated, and I think they're right, the Sassoons probably made more than $1 billion in the opium trade, which they then converted into real estate holdings and so forth when opium was finally made illegal. But when you look at the documents, it's clear that the Sassoons knew how bad opium was. They often had to fire their own employees, their own Chinese employees, who were addicted to opium because they couldn't function. The Sassoons never took opium themselves. even though you could use it in England for, aspirin hadn't been invented yet, for example, so people took a tincture of opium for headaches. But the Sassoons very cleverly, they sort of played the system. One way they got in with British royalty was by giving King Edward a chance to buy stock in opium that they were trading and selling. They were very influential in the British government. And whenever people would try to make the opium trade illegal, the Sassoons would lobby against it and fight against it. So I think that, they were of their time and saw an opportunity here. But I think it's also true for both families. They did not see the Chinese as kind of their equals. They were imperialists. And so they never bothered to learn Chinese, which is astonishing when you consider their influence in China. And they dealt with Chinese at a very high level. So they would meet with Chinese officials, the presidents of China, leading Chinese businessmen who could speak English. But the rest of the world they saw through their Chinese staff or through fancy parties and things like that. And that really catches up to them, because when the communists are advancing after World War II, both families don't believe that the communists are going to win. Mm-hmm. And one reason why both families lose their fortunes is that they are blind to what's really going on in China. And they're warned. I mean, for example, Victor Sassoon, who I'll talk about later, who was this playboy, one of his girlfriends was a New Yorker writer, Emily Hahn, a very famous writer at the time, who at the same time she was having an affair with Victor Sassoon, was having an affair with a leftist Chinese writer who was very close to the communists, knew Zhou Enlai and so forth. And she would have dinner with Victor Sassoon and say, Victor, these communists are serious. They're going to conquer the country. And Victor would be like, no, we have nothing to worry about. And the Qadharis too believe really up until the very end that the communists are not a serious threat. So they did live in a bubble. The Qadharis, for example, lived in a mansion in Shanghai that had 43 rooms, a ballroom as big as a football field, for only 3 people. And that was their physical bubble. And I think it represented the kind of mental bubble that they lived in as well.
So I'm listening, and your book has everything. It's got war, sex, decadence, playboys. At the same time, there's one more thing I just wanted to bring up about the book. Almost everything you're saying about the Sassoons, particularly in China, reminds me of the arguments that are going on between now in America about the Southerners who owned slaves and property in the 19th century. You say they were people of their time. And we're in a moment where we're making kind of absolute judgments about people without historical perspective.
Right. Well, yeah, I was very conscious of that. And I think that while we can judge people from the 21st century, we also have to recognize, who they were. So for example, it's easy to look at the Sassoons. So one of the examples, so the Sassoons, David Sassoon, the patriarch, has these 8 sons. And he sends the sons off to around the world to establish kind of nodes of the empire. And he keeps all their wives close by in a compound, literally a compound. And you can look at that and say, what a barbaric thing. He's sending off his sons to do things, and the wives are almost kept as kind of prisoners. But in fact, what David Sassoon did while his sons were away was he brought in tutors to educate the wives of his sons in English and in the social graces and in cooking, because he suspected at some point they were going to be accompanying their husbands to London, to Shanghai, to other parts of the world, and he wanted them to be able to participate in that life. And he's so successful that one of his granddaughters actually takes over the family empire at one point in the late 1900s because her husband has died very young. And the son is not yet old enough to take over the business. But this woman, Flora Sassoon, who has been educated, by David Sassoon and by other Sassoons, is so accomplished. She speaks several languages. She's learned a lot. at a time in India where not only you couldn't vote if you were a woman, you couldn't even be seen in public if you were a woman in India in the late 19th century. She takes over this vast business empire that stretches from Bombay to Baghdad to Shanghai. And she runs it very successfully. In an echo of today, there's a plague that takes place in Bombay, and a lot of her workers are afraid to go to work. She funds a search for a vaccine. When they find a vaccine, she goes out in public and has a photograph taken of her getting a vaccine shot into her bare arm, which is scandalous at the time, but which her workers, her Indian workers, look at and say, if this wealthy British Jewish lady is willing to get the vaccine, it must be safe. And it helps stop the plague in Bombay. So, I look at that and I think, these families were more complex, and that the women especially, I think, were finding ways to be assertive, even though, as it turns out, all the brothers in the Sassoon family resented Flora's success, right, and ultimately kind of kicked her out of the company in a boardroom coup. And then she went to London and became a very famous hostess. So there were these family tensions. But I think the role of women in all these families shows that they were progressive. So when we're passing judgment on them, we've got to make sure that we're remembering the times that everyone lived in.
I do want to point out that another of those women, Rachel, got into your world.
Right. Yeah, Rachel Sassoon, again, at a time when women in Britain couldn't vote, Rachel Sassoon becomes the publisher of not one, but two leading newspapers in London. She marries a very wealthy industrialist who kind of buys her these two newspapers because it's sort of, it'll amuse her. But she was very progressive, would attend these conferences about women's rights in the early 1900s, got involved in the Dreyfus affair, where she broke some important news that ended up leading to Dreyfus being freed. But again, this kind of says something about, somebody called it the bamboo ceiling that a lot of these women face. She's very successful. When her husband dies, she falls into a depression, not surprisingly. And the men in her family use this as a chance to basically commit her to a lunatic asylum. And she ends her life kind of under a kind of a master of lunacy, it's called. Mm-hmm. And so it shows again that when women, they could achieve a great deal, but then they would hit this point where the men, even the men in the family, would sort of step in and say, well, okay, we've got to take control again.
That's one of the things, I was riveted about in the storytelling. It's enchanting because there are no perfect characters.
Right.
There are people with strong business sense and even a strong moral sense who have problems, and strong women, including Laura, who I really like.
Right.
And she gets to die tragically, being brave. But I want to come down now, narrow it a bit more to people. I know everyone who reads the book tells me, here's who I liked, here's who I didn't like. We have a ranking of favorite people. I have my own. But tell me about, just as they occur to you, these Sassoons and Qadharis who are so enchanting as people to talk about. Which ones fascinate you the most in descending order?
Well, I think Victor Sassoon has to be the best one. In fact, joining us is I saw Ann Peterson, who's the librarian at the SMU Library in Dallas. And for reasons I'll explain when I tell Victor's story, his diaries ended up at SMU. And I think Ann and I both kind of took great delight in sort of uncovering his story because it's really remarkable. So as I said, David Sassoon, the patriarch, sent his sons all over the world. And the London branch, they really loved the life in London. They bought country houses. They sent their children to Eton. They palled around with the Prince of Wales. They would go on weight loss cures with the King of England to Bavaria. I mean, they were very much part of the royal set. And Victor Sassoon was in the 1910, 1920, was your swell playboy, went to Cambridge, always had a chorus girl on each arm, was really living the life. And the family didn't have much hope for him. They figured he would just be somebody who would spend money but never make it. And he was quite a playboy at university and then afterwards. But then in World War I, he was in a plane crash and was injured. He became crippled. He lost the use, or his legs were severely damaged. And psychologically, that really affected him. And he was really in some ways humiliated and felt that nobody would ever appreciate him or love him in England because he always had to have two canes to walk and to get around. And so he decides to leave England and go to India, where all the money is being made in the family, and takes over the business. And it turns out, contrary to what everybody thought back in London, he's a brilliant businessman, very successful in London, and then looks at China and Shanghai, and this is in the 1920s, 1930s, and thinks, you know, this is a place where I can make even more money. And so he moves to Shanghai, takes all his money and invested in Shanghai and builds this hotel, the Peace Hotel, which is by far the fanciest hotel in Asia. He brings in architects from Europe. He brings in people from Germany to run the restaurants. It's just a remarkable place. And it becomes kind of the center, not only of social life in Shanghai, but makes Shanghai one of the great cities of the world. Charlie Chaplin comes over, takes a ship over to stay in the Cathay Hotel. Noel Coward writes Private Lives there. Wallace Simpson, who will end up seducing King Edward and having him leave the throne, has dirty pictures taken in Shanghai of her dressed only in a life jacket. So that's kind of what Shanghai was like. Victor Sassoon turned it into a place that was naughty, but also exotic, but also had all the comforts that you could get in London at this hotel. And he gave incredible parties. His parties were legendary. He would dress up as a circus master and have all the people who came dress up as circus acts. He would dress up as a schoolmaster and have people dress up as various school children. When I went to Shanghai and I visited, the hotel is still there. It's now called the Peace Hotel. And they've restored Victor Sassoon's suite, his penthouse suite where he lived. And when I went there, I went through it, and the bathroom was beautiful and ornate, and it had 2 bathtubs in it. And I said to the Chinese guide, I said, why are there 2 bathtubs in Victor Sassoon's bathroom? And he said, well, Mr. Sassoon always said he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So that gives you a sense of kind of what life was like in Shanghai and what Victor Sassoon was doing. But at the same time, one of the great moments, I think, between the Qadharis and the Sassoons is that starting in the late 1930s, these cruise ships that are bringing all the swells from Europe, Charlie Chaplin, Noel Coward, Wallace Simpson, suddenly start bringing Jewish refugees. This is at a time in the late 1930s, remember, when Jews were trying to get out of Berlin, out of Vienna, and nobody would take them in. The United States, everyone had shut their doors to these refugees who were trying to flee the Nazis. But word got out that because Shanghai was partially occupied by the British, partially occupied by the Japanese, partially occupied by the Americans, by the French, you didn't need a visa to get in. If you showed up, you could, walk onto the shore. And so these Jews start booking passage. They leave Vienna and Berlin, they make their way to Italy, get on these cruise ships, and then show up in Shanghai, where again, they don't speak Chinese. They don't really know where they are. They're just so desperate to escape. They heard about this place called Shanghai, and so they would go there. And so as these Jewish refugees are showing up, Eli Qadhari, who's the patriarch from the family that the Sassoons always look down on, makes his way over to the Cathay Hotel, takes the elevator up to Victor Sassoon's beautiful office. And he says to Victor Sassoon, you know what, Victor, you've got to stop all this Playboy stuff. You're the most powerful Jew in town, and this is a crisis for our people, and you need to step up. And I think of that moment, what it must have meant for Eli Qadhari to kind of swallow his pride and turn to Victor Sassoon and say this, but also what it meant for Victor Sassoon to hear this. Because I often say Victor Sassoon was much more likely to give money to a synagogue than to set foot in one. I mean, he was not, a religious man. He was what we would consider today, a Reform Jew. You know, he was not, religion did not play a big part in his life. But I think he understood that what was going on with the Nazis posed a threat, you know, to his family in Europe, but to Jews everywhere. And so Victor Sassoon does really step up. He begins to, he allows these Jews who are coming off the boats to stay in his, he's built many office buildings. He turned several of them into dormitories, into cafeterias where these Jews can stay. He owns a lot of property in a poorer neighborhood of Shanghai, which he allows Jews to move into. But the most important thing he does is he actually begins to convince the Japanese to protect the Jews, because the Japanese at this point have surrounded Shanghai. They've already invaded China. They're coming from the north. They're surrounding Shanghai. They don't want to provoke war with the US or Britain or France, so they haven't conquered Shanghai yet, but they're there and they've occupied parts of it. And the Japanese are interesting. They actually believe, they're anti-Semitic, and they believe that Jews control the world, but they also believe that somehow if they get the Jews on their side, maybe the Jews can help them. And they identify Victor Sassoon as the most important Jewish person in Shanghai and perhaps in the world at that point. And so Victor Sassoon, being a very charming businessman, does nothing to convince them otherwise. He invites this anti-Semitic captain, a Japanese captain who's put in charge of Shanghai's Jewish problem. He invites him to the hotel, to his nightclub. He wines and dines him. He says, bring your officers, they can eat here. I'm glad to have them. At the same time, he has the people in the hotel spying on the Japanese when they do eat and drink there. And he says to the Japanese anti-Semitic captain, you know what, I'll speak to Roosevelt, I'll speak to Churchill, I'll keep the US out of the war, I'll keep Britain out of the war. And all the time, he's secretly giving money to these Japanese refugees, these Jewish refugees who are showing up, and is in fact even flying off to South America to see if he can buy land where these Jews can be resettled. As a result of that, and the efforts of a lot of other Jewish families in Shanghai, 18,000 Jewish refugees flee Vienna, Berlin to Shanghai, and none of them are killed during the war. The Japanese eventually catch on to what Victor Sassoon is doing, and he has to flee the country right before Pearl Harbor. But even though the Japanese conquer Shanghai, they control the lives of all these Jews, nothing ever happens to them. The Germans, the Nazis, in fact, send people to Shanghai who have been involved in the final solution already in Poland and in Europe. And they say to the Japanese, look, you've got all these Jews here. What we think you should do is gather them all up, put them on barges, and then sink them in the river right in front of the Cathay Hotel. And that'll solve your Jewish problem. But the Japanese don't do that. Instead, they make the Jews live in a neighborhood, in a ghetto, but they never attack them. They never murder them. They never put them into death camps or anything like that. So in a way, one of the tragedies to me about Victor Sassoon is he never was fully acknowledged what he did. He never talked about it much afterwards. He ended up fleeing China when the communists took over. He settled in the Bahamas, married his nurse. His nurse was from Dallas, which is why his papers ended up at the SMU library. But when I spoke to his wife's niece, I had a long talk with her, and she knew Victor Sassoon when he was an old man. And I said, did he ever talk about this miraculous thing he did to save all these Jews? And she said, no, he never mentioned it. It was never something he talked about. So it's almost like Schindler's List, you know, if no one really knew the story while Victor Sassoon was alive. It's only come out subsequently. And really, I think in my book is the first time his role is sort of acknowledged. So as you say, people are incredibly complex, and Victor Sassoon, just for the kind of fun he had in his life, but also at this one moral moment where he steps forward and really does something heroic, he's sort of number one on my favorite list.
I have to add to make that story even more miraculous. You allude to it in the book, but the Jews who went to Shanghai became some of the most extraordinary people in the West. My wife and I have been to Shanghai and visited the little Jewish museum And actually, thanks to her persistence and good idea, about 3 years ago, we hosted at the University of Texas at Dallas a conference and a exhibit on the Jews of Shanghai.
Right.
It's extraordinary. We have a book. The first book given to me on my first trip to China was called The Jews of Shanghai. And it's a wonderful compendium produced in China about this remarkable event, but I don't think Victor Sassoon is mentioned in it.
Right. Well, one of the, as you say, the people, I mean, Larry Tribe, the Harvard law professor, but one of the most interesting stories is in 1979, when the US normalizes relations with China. Michael Blumenthal is the Secretary of the Treasury, and Carter sends him over to China to negotiate trade deals and stuff like that. And Michael Blumenthal was born in Berlin, and his family had fled Berlin after Kristallnacht. So Michael Blumenthal is in Beijing negotiating a trade deal. And in the middle of it, he starts speaking in Chinese. And the Beijing officials are stunned by this. And they say, well, how can you speak Chinese, Mr. Blumenthal? We know you were born in Berlin, but you've grown up in America. He said, no. He said, I grew up in Shanghai for several years during World War II. And he said, I bet my Shanghai dialect is better than yours. So I was in Shanghai doing research, and some of the professors there took up the story, and they said they got a phone call from Beijing saying, we've got this crazy American official, this really powerful Secretary of the Treasury. He said he grew up in Shanghai. How is that possible? And so Michael Blumenthal, though, gets on a plane, takes these officials from Beijing to Shanghai and shows them where he lived in Shanghai, in this neighborhood during World War II. And you can now go there, and his house has a plaque in front of it, and they've preserved a lot of it. And in fact, when I spoke to the Chinese officials, when I first started going to China back in 79, 1980, they said, we were going to level this whole area. It's prime real estate. We were going to build office towers there. But they said all these Jews kept on coming back saying their grandparents had lived here, or they wanted to show their children where they'd grown up. And so they decided to build a Jewish museum. And there's a very good exhibit there now. And Benjamin Netanyahu is there all the time. So it's really a fascinating way in which Jews and Chinese have built this connection. And the most moving thing, I think, is that, again, remember, the Jews couldn't speak Chinese, the Chinese couldn't speak German, or they couldn't really communicate. One of the things you hear from all the Jewish refugees, and I was lucky enough to speak to some of them who are still alive, they're in their 90s now, but even reading their memoirs, what the Jewish refugees say over and over again is how nice the ordinary Chinese were to them. They were living in these neighborhoods, cheek by jowl, with Chinese families who themselves were being oppressed by the Japanese. They didn't have enough to eat. They were terrified by the war. But they said, we left places in Berlin and Vienna where our neighbors had turned on us. They were chasing us down the street. They were seizing our apartments. They were making us, scrub the sidewalks. We got to Shanghai. The Chinese couldn't understand a word they said, but they were nice to us. They would give bread to our children. They would look after us. They would take our children for rickshaw rides. Yeah. And I think that's something that showed a kind of human connection between the two groups that's really, really remarkable. Peter Max, who many of you may remember, was that great, did that great artwork and posters in the 1960s. He says, he learned how to draw from his Chinese maid. So there were all these kind of connections that were built there that are really, really remarkable.
Yeah, it continues. On all my trips to China, the Chinese people are far more outward looking and far more friendly, and they're very kind when you're there to help you in any way possible.
No, it's really true. It's really true.
We're going to start taking questions, and just as a public announcement, I would like to encourage anyone who'd like to ask a question to submit it in writing to Karen so that we can read them and be much more efficient that way. But before we get to the questions, I do want to ask about Lawrence and Horace. Horace is among my favorites. He's this dear man. I wish I could be more like him, who particularly in Hong Kong with the farmers, what was so admirable. And Lawrence's work, could you really talk about them a little to get equal time.
You know, when I was first thinking of the book, you know, you go through this thing where you meet with publishers and they all quiz you because they want to decide whether they want to publish it or not. And the publishers would always say, is this a book about, is this a China story? Is it a Jewish story? And I would always say, no, it's a family story.
Yeah.
And the Qadhari family, you know, the patriarchs of both family, the Sassoons and the Qadharis, were very strong men. And they really had to hold their families together. And the Qadharis, Eli Qadhari had made a lot of money already in Shanghai. He was in his 30s, and it came time for him to find a wife. And he did what a lot of, you know, people did at that time. He didn't fly. He took a ship to London and met Laura Makata, who was from a very prominent Jewish family in London, one of the richest families in London. And they fell in love and they got married. Now, typically what would happen is that he would leave Laura, pregnant probably, in London, and he would return to China to make his fortune and go back and forth, kind of dropping in every now and then while Laura lived a sort of society life. But Laura, his wife, was already quite independent. She had traveled a great deal. She was older than he was. She was already in her 30s, which again, in 1905, I mean, or the late 1800s made you a spinster. She announced, no, I'm going with you. I'm going back to China with you. And one of the great moments of researching this book was when her grandson, Michael, who runs the family now, had found a diary that Laura had kept from about 1900 when she landed in Hong Kong until 1920. And it was remarkable. It was like reading Katharine Hepburn or something in The African Queen, because she is traveling around China with these two babies. I mean, she had a governess and all that, but she's, you know, on these rivers, seeing, you know, in the middle of a fight between the Japanese and the Russians in their gunboats. She's, you know, on rickshaws, careening through Shanghai and Beijing, seeing the terrible poverty. And one of the things that happens, as I said, she in a way becomes the conscience of the family. She pushes her husband to found schools for girls in Baghdad, but also in China, which again is extraordinary. I mean, this is in 1900. And she's saying not only fund schools for Chinese, but for Chinese girls, because she believes that if girls have independence and education, they can lift the whole society up. So she keeps this wonderful diary. And in 1920, she wants a permanent home. And so her husband buys a mansion in Shanghai, not the 43-room one, a smaller one. And they move in there with the children. And a house fire breaks out, and Laura escapes, but then she's worried that the governess, who takes care of the two boys, is trapped inside. So she runs back inside, and it turns out the governess has gone out through another door. Laura is lost in the smoke, and she dies tragically. And that story is important for a couple of reasons. The Chinese tell that story to this day, because the idea that a British aristocratic woman would run into a fire to save a Chinese servant is something that was just unimaginable to most Chinese. And it's something that really, I think, makes a deep imprint into the minds of many Chinese. But it also means that Eli, the patriarch, is left with these two boys. And he moves to London. He's obviously brokenhearted. But for business reasons, he has to move back to Shanghai. And he brings the boys with him. The boys at this point are just starting university. He yanks them out. Lawrence wants to become a lawyer. Horace wants to become an architect. He says, no, you're coming with me. You're coming to Shanghai. You're going to help me run my business. And they do a good job, but they're clearly under their father's shadow for all those years. And when the Japanese invade after Pearl Harbor, the Qadharis don't get out in time. And the three are imprisoned, Eli the patriarch, Horace, and Lawrence. And one of the things that you see is that Lawrence and Horace are brothers. Lawrence is always the elder brother, and he's in Hong Kong and before the war, and Horace is in Shanghai. And Horace, as you say, has the dreamer spirit about him. And so Lawrence is always criticizing him, as elder brothers sometimes do, saying, you've got to pay more attention to the business. You've got to listen to me. And Horace actually really comes into his own when these Jewish refugees start showing up. And he sets up a school for them. He hires teachers. And his brother Lawrence in Hong Kong is saying, you've got to pay attention to the business. And Horace says, I'm sorry, I can't write back to you now. I've got an important meeting to help the refugees. So after the communists take over, Eli Qadharis, their father, dies in Japanese captivity, quite tragically. He actually dies in the servants' quarters of his own mansion. So Lawrence and Horace are in their 40s. They're left to their own devices in Hong Kong. And they decide two things. One is that Lawrence will run the business. He's got the business mind. He should run it. But they also conclude that their father made a terrible mistake, that he did live in a bubble. He didn't see that the Japanese and then the communists were going to be coming in and taking over, and that they had to be more attuned to what was going on in Hong Kong. And so at this point, when the communists are taking over in 1949, Chinese refugees are pouring into Hong Kong, mostly farmers from the south of China, pouring into Hong Kong. They don't have enough to eat. They have very little money. And a lot of them are sort of hiding in the countryside around where the Qadharis have a summer house. And Horace Qadhari, the kind of kind, thoughtful one, is living in this house. And his Chinese servant there says to him at one point when he goes outside, Horace Qadhari says, who's that Chinese man in our garden? And the servant says, oh, that's my cousin. He's a gardener, but he's come from China. So using the Chinese maid as a translator, Horace says, who are you? And he said, I'm a farmer. I'm come from China. He goes, I'm a refugee from China. And Horace looks at him and says, well, I'm a refugee from China too. And from that moment, Horace begins to give huge amounts of money to help refugees, not just to give them money, but to help them get back on their feet. He sets up plots of land where they can do farming. The Qadharis begin to fund research in how to plant efficiently. They eventually help 300,000 of these refugees to kind of help themselves. It's sort of like the first micro loans where they'll help them with irrigation pipes and new techniques to grow rice, but especially to grow pigs. And to develop pigs. And in fact, the Chinese developed this saying, which is that the Qadharis know everything about the pig except what it tastes like, because they won't eat pig because they're keeping kosher. But Horace Qadhari really was beloved among the Chinese in Hong Kong and in China because he was the human side of the family. Whereas Lawrence Qadhari was very successful and really was the political side of the family. And he, in all his time in Hong Kong, even when China was Red China and the Cultural Revolution and all that, he always kept avenues of communication open. He never criticized China. He continued to pay the family servants who were in China, getting money to them. And so when China opens up in 1979, one of the first calls that the Chinese make is to Lawrence Qadhari to see if he will invest again in China. And the Qadharis do. And they go back. And when Lawrence Qadhari, who's not a very sentimental man, goes back to Shanghai for the first time, the Chinese take him to the gravestones of his parents. And it's a very emotional moment for him to realize, this is where the family got its start, and he's now returning all those years later. And to this day, the Qadharis meet with Xi Jinping, the president of China. They're the wealthiest family in China, as I said, the wealthiest Western family. They're in Hong Kong. And like everyone in Hong Kong, they're very nervous about what's happening, but their tie to China has remained immensely, immensely strong.
It's almost as if between Lawrence and Horace, the Qadharis answer my question about how you can maintain your ideals and your business acumen, and that's split them between the two brothers.
Exactly, exactly. I think that's very true.
I want to ask people who have questions to submit them in the chat specifically, so we can read that. We're starting to get some questions. Those of you who are as fascinated as I am right now by these stories, the book is even better. So urge you to find the book. The bookstores are now open. You can order things online. People will deliver them to you at the curb. It's really a stunningly good example of the marriage of journalism and serious historical study. So sorry about, I thought I'd give a plug.
No, I appreciate it.
Here's a first question. Actually, I'm going to combine two. When you started writing the book, did you realize how much time and travel would be involved? And a parallel is, did you get a grant to help pay for it?
Right. Well, yeah, financially. So yeah, I mean, the book got a pretty substantial advance. The way publishing works is they give you the money in advance and they trust you'll deliver the book. So that helped. And I was able to sort of combine some travel for work with it. But no, I mean, I didn't really know what to expect when I started. I mean, I knew it was a great story, but as it turned out, I had to go to archives in Jerusalem. I mean, it was interesting. So the families ended up all around the world. So in London, there were a lot of papers from the Sassoon family. And part of it was serendipity. As it turned out, there were papers in the British Library that had been misfiled. And through the help of the librarians there, I found a cache of letters from Victor Sassoon, the Playboy, to a very good friend of his. And those are wonderful because, you know, you live with these characters and you're reading about them, but when you suddenly see their letters, it's like their voices speaking to you from, you know, 100 years ago. And it was really magical to be sitting in the British Library and seeing that. And then I went to Jerusalem, and it turned out that David Sassoon, the patriarch, spoke a version of Arabic, which was called Judeo-Arabic, that was only spoken by Jews who lived in Baghdad, which, as you can imagine today, is not a very big population. And they used these letters. There were these 8 brothers, and they basically wrote thousands of letters to each other, almost as kind of reports from the different parts of the world where they were and how they operated. But they were all in this language that maybe 20 people in the world still speak. Luckily enough, I went to Jerusalem. I met a professor who had a lot of these letters, and I sat literally in his living room for days as he went through them and said, "Oh, this one's interesting," and then he would translate it for me, and I would kind of scribble it. But Dallas, I have to say, was the funniest place, and Anne will, I hope, confirm this for me. I was in the SMU library in the middle of Dallas, and Anne rolled out Victor Sassoon's diaries. So Victor Sassoon was, as I say, a very brilliant businessman. But these were social diaries. These were diaries where he kept track of who he had dinner with, who he was talking to about a business deal. And as I was opening them, these pictures started falling out because he was also an amateur photographer. And a number of the pictures were of these naked women. So there I am in the SMU library with pictures of naked women kind of falling out of these, you know, diaries from the 1930s, you know, hoping that the librarians aren't going to come over and kick me out. Because it turned out that Victor Sassoon, when he wasn't doing business deals, would go up to women and women he would meet at these parties and say, "Would you like to come to my studio and I'll take your picture?" And this is how we met Emily Hahn, the writer from The New Yorker. It's how we met some of the Chinese women. I mean, it was really remarkable. So you never know when you're, you know, going through the archives. People have racier pasts, and if you're lucky, they kind of stuck the photographs in their diaries, and 100 years later, someone's going to find them. So I would suggest for any of you who are keeping letters you're going to share with your family, just go through them unless you want to, you know, have them find out what you were really doing in college back in the day.
Piece of advice from a journalist who might go through your letters someday. I think we've had such a remarkably informative and, to me, enjoyable time. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for your interview, for the book, and for the next book, whatever it is, because I know I'll want to read it. So
thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
Back to the directors of all of this program. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Jonathan and Dennis, I want to thank you very much. Jonathan, I have to admit, before reading your book, I'm embarrassed to say that I was ignorant about most of China's recent history. So for me, though, your book, because of your engaging writing style, read like a novel. And like Dennis alluded, there's this intrigue, these fascinating characters, and a wealth of knowledge about the impact of these two Jewish dynasties that endures until today. So it's amazing. Thank you so much for being with us. Having you has been an honor and a privilege. So I also want to digress and say we can all agree that this year has been challenging for us. We had, as Miriam had alluded before, a tornado, and now COVID, which has affected us all. However, illuminating programs like today and JCC Book Fest provides us with this intellectual and emotional oasis. So we want to again express our thanks to Rochelle Weiss-Crane, the executive producer of the JCC Margot Rosenberg Pulitzer Jewish Book Fest and Jewish Book Council, for enabling us to bring Jonathan to you today. In addition to the other exciting programs that the JCC and the Tycher Library will feature for you this winter and spring. So check out the JCC's website as well as Tycher Library for upcoming programs. We have some exciting news about the Tycher Library. We had feedback from a recent survey of our patrons, which indicates a significant interest in ebooks. So with our current challenges with COVID and reopening the library because of COVID, acquiring an e-system will be able to bring books to you. So stay tuned for more information about that. And then Sunday, December 6th at 10 a.m., in partnership with Israel Together and other Jewish women's organizations in Dallas, we will feature from the Western Galilee author Diana Bletter, who is an American that made Aliyah to Israel. She's going to discuss her book, The Invisible Thread, A Portrait of Jewish American Women. Then if you have time, the first Monday of every month at 10 a.m. via Zoom, the Tycher Library Book Club meets to discuss authors like Jonathan Kaufman. And it's always an engaging discussion, even whether you've read the book or not. Most importantly, though, I want to thank you, our patrons. Your ongoing support of the Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, the Center for Jewish Education, and the Tycher Library enables us, as our Federation logo says, to be here for you, and it's here for good. So thank you so much for your ongoing support. May you all be healthy. God bless. Go vote. Thank you again.